A poor virgin was about to be wrongly imprisoned until a drunken billionaire challenged the judge. In a world where the rich buy justice and the poor have no voice, a quiet young woman stands alone in a courtroom, seconds away from losing her freedom forever. But just when the hammer is about to fall, a wild, stumbling billionaire crashes through the doors and flips the entire trial upside down. What starts as a reckless outburst turns into a nationwide shockwave, because the challenge he makes is forbidden, and millions of people are now watching. Suddenly, this innocent woman becomes the center of a storm she never asked for, hunted by a system desperate to silence her. And the billionaire who saved her? He's hiding a past that could change everything. As truth battles corruption, if the whole world turns against them, can the powerless and the broken really bring down the system built to destroy them? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The storm clouds gathered ominously over the city skyline as Mara Ellison untied her white apron, her hands still warm from hours of cooking in the nursing home kitchen. Through the window, she could see the first heavy drops of rain hitting the pavement, making the neon signs flicker and dance in their reflections. "You take care getting home now, dear." Mrs. Henderson, one of her favorite residents, called from her wheelchair. The elderly woman's eyes crinkled with concern. "The weather's turning nasty." Mara smiled softly, touching the old woman's shoulder. "I'll be fine, Mrs. Henderson. You get some rest, and I'll see you tomorrow for breakfast. I'm making your favorite blueberry pancakes." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Mara gathered her few belongings, her worn bag slung over her shoulder. She hadn't had time to change out of her work clothes, but her apron would at least keep her uniform dry. The automatic doors whooshed open, releasing her into the wet evening. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the cracked sidewalk. Mara hunched her shoulders, trying to make herself smaller against the weather. The street was oddly quiet for this time of day, with only the occasional hover car humming past, its anti-grav generators leaving ripples in the puddles below. Something felt off. The hair on the back of her neck stood up as she walked, and not just from the cold rain. Every few steps she caught the echo of footsteps behind her, only to turn and find nothing but shadows between the bright neon signs advertising everything from synthetic food to virtual entertainment. Her heart began to beat faster. The transit station was still 3 blocks away, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step. Mara quickened her pace, her wet shoes squeaking against the pavement. The sound of footsteps behind her grew more distinct. When she finally reached the transit station, its stark white lighting felt like a sanctuary. Other commuters huddled under the protective awning, their faces illuminated by personal devices. Mara let out a shaky breath, thinking she was safe in the crowd. That's when she heard his voice. "Miss Ellison." The words cut through the patter of rain like a knife. "A moment of your time, please." Mara turned slowly, her stomach dropping, as she recognized Deputy Justice Director Lionel Cade. He stood there in his perfectly pressed uniform, not a drop of rain touching him thanks to his personal shield generator. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sorry, sir." Mara said quietly but firmly, "I need to catch my transport home." Cade stepped closer, looming over her. "This won't take long. Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere more. Private." The way he said "private" made Mara's skin crawl. She clutched her bag tighter. "I prefer to stay here, sir, in public." His face hardened, that false smile vanishing. "I don't think you understand, Miss Ellison. This isn't a request." "Then I must decline," Mara said, her voice barely above a whisper but steady. Cade's eyes flashed with anger. In an instant, his whole demeanor changed. He straightened up, voice booming across the station. Security! This woman has been stealing public credits from the system! The reaction was immediate. The other commuters scattered like startled birds, leaving a clear space around Mara. Above, 3 security drones descended from their charging stations, their red scanning beams sweeping over her. "No," Mara protested, her heart pounding. "That's not true!" But it was too late. The drones had already tagged her, their automated systems logging the accusation from a high-ranking justice official. Mechanical arms extended, firmly but carefully restraining her. "Citizen Mara Ellison," the lead drone announced in its artificial voice. "You are under arrest for suspected theft of public resources. Please do not resist." Tears mixed with the rain on Mara's face as the drones guided her toward a waiting security transport. Through the glass, she could see Cade's satisfied smirk before he turned and walked away into the storm. The ride to the courthouse was a blur of neon lights and shadow. The transport's windows were tinted, making the city outside look darker than it was. Mara sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, still wearing her damp apron from work. The drones flanked her silently, their presence a constant reminder of her helplessness. When they arrived at the courthouse, Mara was led through a series of sterile corridors to the detention wing. The processing was quick and impersonal. Scans, prints, photos. A bored clerk behind a protective screen handed her a tablet. "Your trial is scheduled for 0900 hours tomorrow morning." The clerk droned. "Please review the charges and enter your plea." Mara's hands shook as she looked at the screen. The charges were written in cold official language, but the meaning was clear. She was being accused of manipulating the credit system at the nursing home, stealing from the very people she cared for every day. "This is wrong," she whispered. "I would never—" The clerk didn't even look up. "Enter your plea, citizen." As Mara was led to her holding cell, she caught glimpses of other areas of the courthouse through the windows. Grand chambers with polished floors, offices with real wooden furniture. But the detention wing was all metal and plastic, harsh lights and cameras watching every move. Her cell was small and cold. A single metal bench protruded from the wall, with a thin blanket folded at one end. The only other feature was a small washroom area, barely screened for privacy. The door hissed shut behind her, its lock engaging with a final-sounding click. Mara sank onto the bench, finally allowing herself to cry properly. She knew how this would go. The trial would be a formality. Cade had probably already arranged the outcome. Who would believe a simple cook over the deputy justice director? "Please," she whispered into the empty cell, her eyes closed tight. "Please help me. I know I'm not important or special, but I need strength. I need courage." Her prayer felt small in the sterile cell, and for a moment she felt more alone than ever. The hours crept by. Mara couldn't sleep, though exhaustion pulled at her. She lay on the hard bench, the thin blanket doing little to ward off the chill, and watched the storm through the narrow window high in her cell. Lightning occasionally illuminated the small space, followed by distant thunder that seemed to mock her prayers. She thought about her residents at the nursing home. Would they wonder where she was when she didn't show up tomorrow? Would anyone tell them what happened? Mrs. Henderson would be waiting for those blueberry pancakes she'd promised. As the night wore on, Mara curled tighter into herself on the bench, her work apron still damp against her skin. Dawn was coming, bringing with it a trial she couldn't win. Yet even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, something deep inside refused to be completely crushed. She might be alone in this cell, but she knew the truth. Sometimes, she thought, that had to be enough. Outside, the storm gradually began to fade, but Mara remained awake, watching shadows move across her cell wall as vehicles passed by on the street below. Each passing hour brought her closer to morning, closer to facing whatever Cade had planned for her. Sleep remained elusive, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer and fears she couldn't quiet. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered to life in Mara's cell at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. She hadn't slept more than a few minutes at a time, and her body ached from the hard metal bench. Her work apron, now wrinkled and stiff from drying overnight, still smelled faintly of the chicken soup she'd made yesterday. Was it really just yesterday? At 8:30, 2 security officers arrived to escort her to the courtroom. Their footsteps echoed through the long, sterile hallway, the sound mixing with the quiet hum of surveillance drones that followed overhead. Other early morning staff members passed by, barely glancing at her, as if wrongfully accused citizens were just another part of their daily routine. The tribunal courtroom was massive, designed to intimidate with its soaring ceilings and stark modern architecture. Rows of automated recording screens lined the walls, their red recording lights blinking in silent judgment. The morning light filtering through the high windows did nothing to warm the space. If anything, it made the room feel more clinical and impersonal. City officials filled the benches, their crisp uniforms and badges creating a sea of authority. Mara felt painfully out of place in her food-stained apron and wrinkled clothes. She could feel their stares as the officers led her to the defendant's podium, a simple metal stand that left her exposed on all sides. Deputy Justice Director Lionel Cade sat in the front row, looking perfectly composed in an expensive suit. When their eyes met, he smiled. Not a warm smile, but one that reminded Mara of a cat watching a cornered mouse. She quickly looked away, focusing instead on keeping her hands from shaking as they gripped the podium. The judge entered, and everyone rose. He was older, with steel-grey hair and deep frown lines that suggested he rarely smiled. He didn't even look at Mara as he began the proceedings, his voice carrying the bored tone of someone who had already made up his mind. "Case number 2738-B," he announced, tapping his tablet. "Citizen Mara Ellison, charged with fraudulent manipulation of public credit systems and theft of resources from a state-funded care facility." He glanced at the screens around the room. "The evidence has been uploaded to all displays." Mara's heart sank as she watched doctored footage appear on every screen, security recordings that had been carefully edited to make routine tasks look suspicious, financial records that had been subtly altered. She recognized her own movements in the nursing home kitchen, but the timestamps had been changed, making her late-night meal prep for early shift residents appear like unauthorized activity. "Your Honor," she managed to say, her voice smaller than she intended. "Those records aren't accurate. I never—" "The defendant will speak only when directly questioned." The judge cut her off, not even looking up from his tablet. "The evidence clearly shows systematic abuse of access privileges and misappropriation of resources over a 3-month period." Cade shifted in his seat, drawing the judge's attention. They exchanged a look that made Mara's stomach turn. This wasn't a trial. It was a performance, with a script she hadn't been given. "Does the defendant wish to enter a plea?" the judge asked, finally, looking at her with eyes that held no trace of compassion. Mara swallowed hard. "Not guilty, Your Honor. I've worked at Evergreen Care Home for 5 years. I would never steal from—" "The record will show a plea of not guilty," the judge interrupted again. "Though I must note that the evidence speaks for itself. Given the serious nature of these offenses against our most vulnerable citizens, I am prepared to pass sentence immediately." The room seemed to tilt slightly as Mara realized this was it. No real chance to defend herself, no witnesses called, nothing but a rush to judgment. She could see Cade leaning back in his seat, that same satisfied smirk playing across his face. The judge lifted his gavel, and Mara's heart seemed to stop. In the matter of public credit theft, this court sentences citizen Mara Ellison to 3 years of supervised labor in the municipal. Bang! The heavy courtroom doors slammed open with enough force to make several officials jump in their seats. A man stumbled through the doorway, his expensive but rumpled suit suggesting he'd slept in it. His dark hair was disheveled, and several days' worth of stubble covered his jaw. Behind him, 2 reporters struggled to get past the security officers who had tried to stop them. "Well, well," the man announced loudly, his words slightly slurred. "If it isn't my old friend Judge Harrison, still doing the deputy director's dirty work?" He gestured expansively, nearly losing his balance. "Don't let me interrupt this farce of a trial. It's not like due process matters anymore, right?" Shocked whispers rippled through the courtroom. Mara stared at the stranger, who was now pointing dramatically at the judge while using his other hand to steady himself against a bench. "Order!" the judge shouted, his face flushing red. "Remove this man immediately." But the intruder wasn't finished. He straightened up slightly, and despite his obvious intoxication, his eyes were sharp and focused. "Cassian Rowe," he announced to the room at large, "and I'd love to tell everyone here about the interesting financial records I've found. You know, the ones showing how many cases like this get mysteriously resolved in favor of certain influential parties." More murmurs filled the room. Cade had half risen from his seat, his smirk replaced by an expression of barely controlled rage. The reporters who had followed Cassian were frantically taking notes, their drones hovering above the scene with recording lights blazing. "This entire proceeding," Cassian declared, his voice cutting through the growing chaos, "is nothing but a cover-up, and I can prove it." He swayed slightly but kept his accusing finger pointed at the judge. "So what's it going to be, Your Honor? Should we discuss this evidence right here, right now?" The courtroom erupted in shocked conversations. Security officers moved uncertainly between Cassian and the bench, waiting for orders. The judge's gavel banged repeatedly, but the control he'd maintained just moments ago had shattered. And Mara, still standing at her podium, watched as her carefully orchestrated downfall suddenly spun into chaos. Cassian Rowe gripped the wooden railing at the front of the courtroom, his knuckles turning white as he steadied himself. He pulled a monogrammed handkerchief from his wrinkled suit pocket and wiped his face, taking a deep breath. When he looked up, his bloodshot eyes held a strange clarity despite his disheveled appearance. "I invoke the right of trial by audience," he announced, his voice ringing through the suddenly silent courtroom. "As permitted by the original charter, Section 7, before it was struck from public record 30 years ago." Gasps erupted throughout the room. Several older officials exchanged worried glances, while younger ones looked confused. The ancient custom had been outlawed decades ago, deemed too unpredictable for modern justice. The judge's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "Mr. Rowe," he sneered, emphasizing each word, "you are clearly intoxicated and in no position to make legal challenges. Perhaps you should sleep it off in a holding cell." "Oh, I'm drunk, all right," Cassian agreed, flashing a lopsided grin. "But I'm still sober enough to recognize a rigged trial when I see one." He straightened his tie with exaggerated care. "And I'm definitely sober enough to make a wager." Mara watched the exchange with growing confusion. She had never heard of trial by audience, and this strange man's intervention seemed more likely to make things worse than better. Yet something in his confident stance gave her a flicker of hope. "A wager?" The judge's tone dripped with contempt. "This is a court of law, not a gambling house. If the public finds Mara Ellison guilty," Cassian declared, "I will donate 50% of my personal fortune to the Justice Department. That's roughly 4 billion credits, give or take a few million." He paused as another wave of whispers swept the room. "But when they find her innocent, you will submit your immediate resignation." The reporter's drones zoomed in closer, their recording lights pulsing urgently. One of the journalists was already broadcasting live, her whispered commentary barely audible. "Billionaire Cassian Rowe has just challenged—" The judge slammed his gavel down. "This is absurd. I will not be party to this circus." "Too late," Cassian said, pulling out his personal device. "The stream is already live across all city networks. 4 million viewers and climbing." He turned to address the cameras directly. "Citizens, you've seen the evidence presented. You've seen how this trial has been conducted. Now you decide. Is Mara Ellison guilty of theft, or is she the victim of corruption?" Mara's heart pounded as she watched the massive display screens around the courtroom suddenly fill with incoming votes and comments. The number of viewers skyrocketed. 5 million, 8 million, 12 million. Comments scrolled, passed faster than she could read. "I know Mara. She cooks for my grandmother at Evergreen." Those financial records look tampered with. "No proper defense allowed. What kind of trial is this? Look at how scared she is. That's not a criminal." The vote counter spun upward, percentages shifting in real time. 73% innocent. 78%. 82%. Deputy Director Cade stood up, his face contorted with rage. "This is completely illegal. Guards, arrest—" "Sit down, Lionel." Cassian interrupted, his words still slightly slurred, but his eyes razor-sharp. "Unless you want me to share those interesting files about your private account in the Cayman Islands." Cade sank back into his seat, his face draining of color. The vote counter continued to climb. 85% innocent. 87. 89. The comments poured in by the thousands, overwhelmingly supportive of Mara. People who knew her from the nursing home, residents' family members, even former co-workers, all testified to her character and honesty. When the final results locked in at 91% declaring her innocent, Mara's legs gave out. She gripped the podium, tears streaming down her face as relief flooded through her. The nightmare was ending. She was going to be okay. The judge sat frozen on his bench, staring at the numbers with a look of utter disbelief. The courtroom had fallen completely silent, everyone waiting for his response. Finally, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He began, his voice barely audible. "I hereby—" He couldn't seem to finish the sentence. Cassian wobbled slightly as he turned to face the bench. His expression suggested he was just as surprised as everyone else that his impulsive challenge had worked. For a moment, he looked almost lost, as if he hadn't planned what to do next. Mara pressed her hands to her mouth, trying to contain the sobs of gratitude threatening to overwhelm her. She looked at Cassian, this stranger who had risked billions of credits and his own reputation to save her, and saw him staring at the vote results with an expression of wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd just done. The light from the courtroom windows had shifted to the warm glow of late morning, illuminating the faces of everyone present as they witnessed this extraordinary moment. The ancient tradition of trial by audience, forbidden for so long, had just changed everything in the span of 15 minutes. The reporters' drones continued to hover, recording every detail of the historic scene. The stunned judge, the fuming deputy director, the grateful defendant, and the disheveled billionaire who had turned the entire justice system upside down on what appeared to be a drunken whim. The heavy courthouse doors groaned open, and 2 officers grudgingly removed Mara's restraints. Her wrists ached where the cuffs had dug into her skin. Blinking in the bright midday sun, she stepped outside to an unexpected sight. Hundreds of people had gathered on the courthouse steps, their devices raised high to capture every moment. "There she is!" someone shouted, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Mara instinctively stepped back, overwhelmed by the wall of noise and flashing screens. Her legs still felt wobbly from the emotional drain of the trial. "Easy there," Cassian murmured behind her. He shrugged off his expensive coat, which looked like it had seen better days, and draped it over her shoulders. The fabric was warm and smelled faintly of bourbon. "Let's get you through this mob." Cassian stumbled slightly as he guided her down the steps. He paused at a decorative fountain, splashing cold water on his face and running wet hands through his disheveled hair. "Sorry about them." He gestured vaguely at himself. "State of things. Didn't exactly plan this intervention." "Thank you," Mara said softly. "I don't know how to repay—" "Don't." He cut her off, wiping his face with his sleeve. "Just doing what needed doing." The crowd pressed closer, shouting questions and congratulations. Dozens of personal drones hovered overhead, their cameras tracking every move. Several people reached out to touch Mara's arm or shake her hand. The attention made her chest tight with anxiety. "Ms. Ellison, how does it feel to be free?" "Mr. Rowe, was this a planned protest?" "Mara, over here!" A young woman pushed forward with her daughter. "My mother is at Evergreen Home," she said, tears in her eyes. "You always make her favorite soup when she's having a bad day. We knew you couldn't be guilty." Mara's vision blurred with tears of her own. She reached out to squeeze the woman's hand, too choked up to speak. The peaceful moment shattered as emergency tones blared from every screen and device in the vicinity. The crowd fell silent, heads turning towards the nearest public display. A stern-faced announcer appeared, reading from an official statement. "By emergency decree of the City Council, this morning's irregular court proceeding has been declared invalid due to prohibited interference with standard judicial process. The previous charges against Mara Ellison remain in effect, with an additional warrant issued for inciting rebellion through manipulation of public sentiment. All citizens are required to report any sightings of the accused. Failure to comply will result in—" Panic erupted through the crowd. People began backing away from Mara, their supportive smiles replaced by fearful glances. Above them, security drones activated their scanning protocols with high-pitched whines. "Time to go," Cassian said sharply, grabbing Mara's hand. His eyes, suddenly much clearer, darted between the advancing drones. "Now!" He pulled her through the scattering crowd toward a narrow side street between two towering buildings. The alley was dark despite the midday sun, filled with steam from underground vents and the hum of industrial equipment. "Wait!" Mara gasped, struggling to keep up. "Where are we?" "Less talking, more running," Cassian replied, leading her deeper into the maze of service corridors. "They'll have every exit monitored within minutes. We need to be gone before nightfall." The sounds of chaos from the courthouse grew fainter as they wound through the industrial maze. Massive cooling units and power transformers created shadowy hiding spots. Steam hissed from overhead pipes, temporarily obscuring the view of any pursuing drones. Cassian seemed to know exactly where he was going, despite his earlier intoxication. He moved with purpose, checking corners before pulling Mara forward, always staying close to the walls. A searchlight swept across the alley behind them, casting stark shadows. Mara's heart hammered in her chest as she heard the mechanical whir of approaching drones. Cassian yanked her behind a large ventilation unit just as the beam passed over their previous position. "Trust me," he whispered, his face inches from hers in the cramped space. Mara nodded without hesitation. After what he'd done in the courtroom, how could she not? "Good," he said, already moving again. "Because things are about to get much worse before they get better." They pressed deeper into the industrial sector as more searchlights crisscrossed the darkening streets behind them. The setting sun cast long shadows through the urban canyons, and somewhere in the distance, sirens began to wail. Cassian's hand was warm and steady around hers as they ran. For someone who had appeared barely able to stand straight in court, he moved with surprising grace now, as if the crisis had burned away the alcohol fog. Yet Mara could feel fine tremors in his grip. Whether from lingering intoxication or fear, she couldn't tell. Steam billowed around them as they ducked through a maintenance access way. The searchlights swept closer, accompanied by the increasing drone of security units. Mara's borrowed coat fluttered behind her as they fled deeper into the gathering shadows, away from everything familiar and safe, toward an uncertain future as fugitives. The industrial corridors seemed endless, each turn leading to another identical passage. Their footsteps echoed off metal walls and concrete floors, mixing with the constant hum of machinery. Behind them, the searchlights continued their relentless sweep, steadily closing the distance. After 15 minutes of running through industrial corridors, Cassian finally slowed their pace. He led Mara down a spiral maintenance staircase, the metal steps clanking beneath their feet. The air grew cooler and damper as they descended underground. "Almost there," he whispered, his voice echoing in the confined space. "Just stay close." At the bottom of the stairs, they emerged into a vast underground chamber. Old transit signs hung askew from crumbling concrete walls, their faded letters barely visible in the dim emergency lighting. Abandoned maintenance equipment lay scattered about, covered in years of dust. "What is this place?" Mara asked, her voice hushed. Cassian ran his hand along a grimy wall until he found an ancient control panel. Used to be part of the original transport network, before they built the new elevated lines. Most people don't even know it exists anymore. He pried open the panel's cover, exposing a tangle of wires. "I used these tunnels years ago, when I was different." "Different how?" Mara watched as he worked with the wires, his fingers moving with practiced precision despite their earlier trembling. Cassian was quiet for a moment, focused on his task. "I wasn't always the drunk billionaire making scenes in courtrooms, used to actually try to change things." He gave a harsh laugh. "Led protests, exposed corruption, leaked documents proving how deep the rot went. They called me a whistleblower. I called it basic human decency." A spark jumped between the wires, and suddenly ancient lights flickered to life along the platform. In the improved visibility, Mara could see an old maintenance tram sitting on the tracks, its metal surface dulled with age but seemingly intact. "What happened?" she asked softly. Cassian's shoulders tensed. "They destroyed me, planted evidence, turned public opinion against me, made sure no one would ever believe anything I said again." His voice grew bitter. "Sound familiar?" Mara thought of her own situation, how quickly they had tried to tear down her reputation, her life. "Yes," she whispered. He moved to the tram, working to open its control panel. "After that, I realized the only way to fight back was from the shadows. Used what was left of my family's money to build a new identity, new influence. But I stopped fighting openly." His hand stilled on the wires. "Until today. Guess old habits die hard." The tram's ancient motor hummed to life. Cassian helped Mara inside, then took the controls. The vehicle moved slowly along the tracks, its wheels squealing slightly from disuse. Above them, they could hear the muffled sounds of search units passing overhead. As they rode through the darkness, Mara studied Cassian's profile in the dim light. The reckless drunk from the courtroom was gone, replaced by someone more focused, more haunted. She saw now that his earlier behavior had been a mask. Perhaps one he'd worn for so long it had started to feel real. "Why did you help me?" she asked after several minutes of silence. Cassian kept his eyes on the dark tunnel ahead. "Because when I saw you in that courtroom, looking exactly like they wanted you to look, alone, helpless, discredited, I couldn't watch it happen again. Not when I could stop it." Hours passed as they traveled through the underground network. Mara dozed fitfully in her seat, while Cassian remained alert at the controls. The tram's gentle swaying and the rhythmic sound of wheels on tracks created an almost peaceful atmosphere, despite their circumstances. As the first hints of dawn began to filter through ventilation grates far above, Cassian guided the tram into a final station. This one was smaller than the others, clearly designed for maintenance access rather than public use. A narrow stairway led up to the surface. "Where are we?" Mara asked, stretching her stiff muscles as they climbed the stairs. "About 30 miles outside the city," Cassian replied. "There's a community out here. Veterans who didn't want to live under the new system. I help them stay off the grid, keep their independence." They emerged into cool morning air. Mara saw they were in a rural area, with scattered buildings visible through the early morning mist. A cluster of well-maintained houses sat behind a simple fence, their windows still dark in the pre-dawn light. Cassian led her toward the largest building. "They don't know me by name or face," he explained quietly. "I've always worked through intermediaries, but they'll help us if we can convince them." The sky was turning pink with sunrise as they approached the front door. Cassian knocked 3 times, then twice more, clearly a signal. After a moment, they heard movement inside. The door opened to reveal 2 elderly men, both standing straight despite their age. Their eyes widened first at Cassian, clearly recognizing him from the news, and then at Mara, still wearing her food service apron under Cassian's coat. "We need help," Cassian said simply. The veterans exchanged glances, decades of military training evident in their quick assessment of the situation. Finally, the taller one stepped back from the doorway. "Better come inside," he said gruffly. "Both of you." The veterans led Mara and Cassian into a warm kitchen that smelled of coffee and fresh bread. Morning light filtered through checkered curtains, casting a homey glow on the worn wooden table and chairs. The taller veteran introduced himself as Colonel Briggs, while his companion, a stockier man with silver hair, was called Thompson. "Sit," Briggs commanded, pulling out chairs. "You both look dead on your feet." Mara sank gratefully into a chair, her body finally registering the exhaustion of the past 24 hours. Cassian remained standing, swaying slightly as he tried to maintain his composure. "I know what the news is saying," Cassian began, "but they're lying about—" "Son," Briggs interrupted, fixing him with a stern look. "Let's get some food in you first, and maybe some coffee to clear your head." Thompson was already at the stove, cracking eggs into a pan while bread toasted nearby. More veterans began filtering into the kitchen, drawn by the voices and cooking smells. They cast curious glances at the newcomers, but maintained a respectful distance. As plates of eggs, toast, and steaming coffee were set before them, Cassian explained the situation. He tried to gloss over his dramatic courtroom entrance, but Briggs wasn't having it. "We saw the feeds," the colonel said bluntly. "You were 3 sheets to the wind, son. That kind of behavior might have worked for a surprise attack, but it won't help protect her now." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "If you're serious about keeping this young lady safe, you need to stay sharp. No more drinking." Cassian flushed, looking down at his coffee cup. "Yes, sir," he muttered, sounding for all the world like a chastised cadet. After breakfast, Mara was shown to a small bedroom where she could rest. She slept deeply for several hours, waking mid-afternoon to find fresh clothes laid out for her, simple but clean garments donated by the veterans' families. Feeling refreshed, she ventured outside and discovered a thriving community garden behind the main building. The sight of neat vegetable rows and flowering herbs made her heart lift. This was something she understood, something familiar. "Would you like to help?" a gentle voice asked. An elderly woman named Grace stood nearby, gardening tools in hand. "We could use some help with the tomatoes." Mara spent the next few hours working alongside Grace and other residents, her hands in the soil, listening to their stories and sharing some of her own. They reminded her so much of the nursing home residents she cooked for, their wisdom, their humor, their appreciation for simple kindnesses. "You're good with plants," Grace observed as Mara carefully staked a tomato plant. "I learned from the residents at my nursing home," Mara explained. "Mr. Chen taught me everything about tomatoes. He used to be a farmer before." Her voice caught as she thought about her friends back at the home, wondering if they were worried about her. Later, she found her way to the community kitchen, where several veterans were preparing dinner. They welcomed her expertise immediately, and soon she was showing them how to properly season a stew while trading cooking tips and gentle banter. The familiar rhythm of kitchen work soothed her nerves. As the sun began to set, the community gathered for dinner at long tables set up in the main hall. The atmosphere was warm and familial, with conversation flowing easily between the veterans and their unexpected guests. Mara noticed that Cassian sat next to Colonel Briggs, nursing a glass of water and looking more clear-eyed than she'd seen him yet. The peaceful mood shifted when the news screens mounted on the wall suddenly lit up with breaking updates. The room fell silent as they watched footage of protests in the city, with people holding signs bearing Mara's image. The caption read, "The auctioned innocent, symbol of resistance." "They're using my face," Mara whispered, watching crowds chant her name. "But I never wanted—" "Sometimes we don't choose our battles," Colonel Briggs said quietly. "Sometimes they choose us." After dinner, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Mara slipped outside. The night air was cool and clean, so different from the city's perpetual haze. Stars sparkled overhead, more stars than she'd ever seen before. She stood in the garden, breathing deeply, trying to process everything that had happened. Just yesterday morning, she had been cooking breakfast for her elderly friends, worried about making ends meet, but otherwise living her quiet life. Now she was a fugitive, her face plastered across news screens, somehow transformed into a symbol of resistance against corruption. The weight of it pressed against her chest. All those people in the streets, holding signs with her name, looking to her for hope. How could she possibly live up to that? She was just a cook who tried to be kind to people, just a girl who'd grown up in the system, who'd learned to keep her head down and work hard. But as she stood there under the vast starry sky, something shifted in her heart. Maybe that was exactly why this had happened to her. Maybe sometimes the biggest changes came from the smallest acts of dignity and defiance. The night air carried the scent of herbs from the garden, rosemary for remembrance. Her residents always said. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, she let herself be present in this moment of peace, surrounded by the gentle sounds of crickets and the soft glow of windows where her newfound protectors kept watch. Dawn broke over the veterans' community with streaks of pink and gold painting the sky. Cassian Rowe sat on the edge of his borrowed bed, head in his hands, fighting the familiar morning craving for a drink. His hands shook slightly, but his mind was clear. He had made a promise to himself, and more importantly, to Mara, that he would stay sober. There was too much at stake now. He splashed cold water on his face and studied his reflection in the mirror. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually neat beard had grown scruffy. "Get it together," he muttered to himself. Outside, the community was already stirring. Several veterans were making their morning patrol rounds, checking the perimeter fences with practiced efficiency. Cassian joined them, grateful for their quiet acceptance and military precision. "Morning, son," Colonel Briggs called out, emerging from the main building with a tablet in hand. "Ready to put those tech skills of yours to work?" Cassian nodded, following the older man to a small office space that had been converted into an impromptu command center. "We need secure communications," he explained, pulling equipment from his bag, the kind that can't be traced or intercepted. For the next several hours, Cassian worked methodically, setting up encrypted channels and installing security protocols he hadn't used since his activist days. His fingers moved surely over the keyboards despite their trembling. Each line of code felt like stepping back in time to when he had believed he could change the world. Meanwhile, Mara had found her way to the community's storage building, where Colonel Briggs was organizing donations of food, clothing, and supplies that regularly came from sympathetic supporters. "Most folks think we're just a retirement village," Briggs explained as he showed her the system. "But we help a lot of people who need to disappear for a while. Good people who've run afoul of bad laws." Mara sorted canned goods onto shelves, thinking about how many meals she could make from these simple ingredients. "Like Cassian?" she asked quietly. The colonel paused, considering his words carefully. "You know, I remember when that boy first made headlines. Must have been 7 or 8 years ago now. He was brilliant, used his tech skills to expose massive financial corruption in the justice system, had evidence of judges taking bribes, officials manipulating cases for profit. He almost brought the whole corrupt system down." "What happened?" Mara asked, though she could guess from the haunted look she sometimes saw in Cassian's eyes. "They destroyed him," Briggs said simply. "Manufactured evidence, false witnesses, planted illegal data in his systems. By the time they were done, his reputation was in tatters. He lost everything except his money, and he only kept that because he'd protected it too well for them to touch." Mara thought about the man who had stumbled drunk into her trial, who had risked everything again to help a stranger. "He's trying to make it right," she said softly. "Maybe you're his second chance," Briggs suggested. "Speaking of which, people need to hear your voice, Mara. The real you, not just what the news is saying." The idea terrified her, but she knew he was right. Later that afternoon, sitting in the garden where she felt most comfortable, Mara recorded a simple message on a secure tablet. No scripts, no fancy production, just her heart. "I'm just a cook," she began, looking directly into the camera. "I take care of elderly people who need good meals and kind words. That's all I've ever wanted to do. But when Deputy Director Cade tried to force me to meet him alone, I said no. I said no because every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "What happened to me in that courtroom happens to people every day. The system that's supposed to protect us is being used to hurt us instead. But violence and anger won't fix this. We need peaceful change, real justice reform, and we need to stand together, with dignity, until those in power remember they're supposed to serve the people, not control us." Within hours of the veterans uploading her message through Cassian's secure channels, it spread across the network like wildfire. People shared it, commented on it, drew strength from her quiet courage and simple truth. As evening approached, Mara found herself on the wide front porch, watching the sun paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. She heard footsteps behind her and knew without looking that it was Cassian. He settled into the rocking chair next to her, his presence steadier than she'd yet seen it. The day's work had tired him, but his eyes were clear and focused. "Your message is everywhere," he said quietly. "People are listening." Mara wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm evening. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Not just for myself, but for everyone who's standing up because of me. What if it all goes wrong? What if people get hurt?" Cassian turned to face her, his expression intense and determined. "Mara, I promise you, I won't let anything happen to you again. Not ever." He paused, his voice growing softer. And maybe this time, with you leading the way, we can actually change things for the better." The sun sank lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the porch. In that moment of golden light, surrounded by the safety of the veterans' community and Cassian's quiet strength, Mara allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was right. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when Cassian's tablet began buzzing with notifications. He sat at the kitchen table, coffee untouched, scrolling through endless streams of support messages flooding in from across the country. Mara's simple, heartfelt video had struck a chord deeper than anyone expected. "Look at this," he called out as Mara entered the kitchen, still wearing borrowed clothes from one of the veterans' granddaughters. "Your message has over 2 million shares. People are organizing peaceful gatherings in Chicago, Atlanta, Houston, everywhere." Mara leaned over his shoulder, her eyes widening at the images filling the screen. Crowds gathered in city squares, holding signs with her words: "Dignity and respect," and "Stand together." Many protesters wore cooking aprons like hers, turning the simple garment into a powerful symbol. "I never meant to start all this," she whispered, her voice trembling. Colonel Briggs appeared in the doorway, his weathered face creased in a smile. Sometimes the most powerful movements start with the smallest acts of courage. "Come on, both of you. We're gathering in the common room." The veterans had transformed their usual meeting space into a command center. Maps covered the walls, and several tablets displayed live feeds from various cities. A dozen elderly residents, their military training evident in their precise movements, worked with focused determination. "We've got confirmation of peaceful demonstrations in 15 major cities," announced Sarah Chen, a former communications officer with silver-streaked hair. "No violence reported. The protesters are following Mara's example. They're just standing quietly, wearing aprons, holding signs." Cassian nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what we need. The government can't justify a crackdown on peaceful protesters without looking like the villains they are." "Which brings us to our next move," Briggs said, unrolling a large map of their own city. "We need to organize our own demonstration, something big enough to force them into holding official hearings about the corruption in the justice system." The veterans gathered around the table, falling naturally into their old roles as strategists. They spent hours planning every detail: crowd management, security measures, emergency protocols. Mara watched in amazement as these elderly men and women transformed before her eyes, their years of experience shining through. During a break, Sarah pulled Mara aside. "You'll need to speak at the demonstration," she said gently. "People need to hear your voice in person." Fear gripped Mara's chest. "I don't know how," she admitted. "I can barely talk in front of 3 people, let alone a crowd." "Then we'll teach you." Sarah smiled. "We've all had to learn to be brave when it matters most." Throughout the afternoon, the veterans took turns helping Mara prepare. They taught her breathing exercises to calm her nerves, techniques for projecting her voice, and ways to connect with an audience. They set up mock scenarios, gradually increasing the number of people she spoke to until she could address the whole room without her voice shaking. "The key is to remember why you're speaking," advised James Martinez, a former sergeant who now tended the community's garden. "Focus on your truth, not your fear." As evening approached, the kitchen filled with delicious aromas as Mara cooked alongside several veterans, finding comfort in the familiar routine. They prepared a late supper, the dining room buzzing with energy and purpose as everyone gathered around the long table. Cassian sat quietly at first, pushing food around his plate. The day's planning had stirred up old memories, and the weight of them showed on his face. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I need to say something," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "Watching all of you today, seeing how much good we might actually accomplish, He paused, struggling with the words. 8 years ago, I had the evidence that could have changed everything. I had proof of every corrupt deal, every fixed trial, every bribe, and I failed. I let them destroy me, and because of that, thousands of innocent people have suffered. The room fell silent. Mara watched as Cassian's hands trembled slightly, his eyes fixed on the table. I started drinking to forget. He continued. To numb the guilt of knowing I had one shot to fix things, and I blew it. And then I saw Mara in that courtroom, facing the same corrupt system, and I couldn't watch it happen again. Mara reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Cassian, she said softly, redemption isn't about being perfect. It's about getting back up and trying again, even when you're scared, even when you've failed before. She squeezed his hand gently. You didn't fail the country. You're here now, helping us try again. That's what matters. The veterans around the table nodded in agreement. Colonel Briggs stood slowly, raising his glass. To new courage, he announced, and to second chances. One by one, everyone at the table stood, raising their glasses. Even the most stoic veterans smiled as they looked at Mara, seeing in her the hope they'd never lost but had waited so long to find again. And there, surrounded by these unlikely allies who had become family, Mara felt her lips curve into a real smile, the first since that terrible night of her arrest. It wasn't a big smile, but it was genuine, carrying with it the promise of better days ahead. To new courage, she echoed softly, raising her glass with the others, her heart full of gratitude and determination. The morning dawned clear and crisp, a perfect day for making history. Cassian had barely slept, going over every detail of the Peace March preparations. He stood at the window of the Veterans Community Center, watching the sun rise over the distant city skyline while sipping his third cup of coffee. Everything's in place, Colonel Briggs assured him, spreading out the final security plans on the kitchen table. We've got 25 veterans positioned along the route, all with emergency training. The medical stations are set up. The permits secured. Now we just need to get Mara there safely. Cassian nodded, his hand steady for the first time in years. 3 days sober had cleared his mind, sharpened his focus. The convoy's ready. 3 vehicles, Briggs confirmed. Armored transport in the middle for you and Mara. Sarah and James leading in the front car. Martinez and I bringing up the rear. We've got encrypted comms and alternate routes if needed. In her room, Mara stood before the mirror, smoothing down the simple white dress Sarah had helped her choose. Her hands trembled as she pinned back her hair, trying to project the calm she didn't feel. There was a gentle knock at the door. Come in, she called softly. Sarah entered, carrying a small box. A gift from all of us, she said, opening it to reveal a delicate silver pendant. For courage. Tears welled in Mara's eyes as Sarah fastened it around her neck. I'm scared, she whispered. Of course you are, dear, Sarah said, squeezing her shoulders. But being brave isn't about not feeling fear. It's about doing what's right anyway. The convoy left at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. Mara sat beside Cassian in the armored transport, clutching her speech notes. He noticed her hands shaking and gently covered them with his own. Just speak from your heart, he said softly. That's what people need to hear. As they approached the city center, they began to see the crowds. Thousands of people lined the streets, more arriving every minute. Many carried handmade signs. Justice for Mara, protect the innocent, reform now. But what took Mara's breath away were the lanterns. Paper lanterns in every color, ready to be lit at dusk, symbols of hope and light in the darkness. The security team guided them to the staging area, where a simple platform had been erected. The veterans took their positions, forming a protective circle. Cassian helped Mara up the steps, then stood back, giving her space but staying close enough to support her if needed. Looking out at the sea of faces, Mara felt her knees weaken. There had to be at least 50,000 people packed into the square and surrounding streets. The crowd fell silent as she approached the microphone, waiting. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to speak. "My name is Mara Ellison." Her voice wavered at first, then grew stronger. 2 weeks ago, I was just a cook at a nursing home, trying to take care of the elderly residents who needed me. Then I was arrested on false charges, nearly sentenced without evidence, and saved only by the courage of strangers who refused to let injustice win. The crowd listened intently as she continued, her words flowing from her heart. "I stand here today not just for myself, but for every person who has faced a system that forgot its purpose, for every family separated by false accusations, for every community living in fear instead of trust. This isn't about politics or power, it's about basic human dignity." Her voice grew passionate, reaching to the furthest edges of the square. "We deserve a justice system that protects the vulnerable, not oppresses them. That serves truth, not power. That brings light to darkness, not more shadows to hide behind." Tears streamed down faces in the crowd as Mara spoke of her own experiences caring for the elderly, of seeing their dignity and wisdom, of learning that true strength comes from serving others. "We're not here for violence or vengeance," she declared. "We're here because we believe in something better. We're here with lanterns, not weapons, with hope, not hate, with determination, not destruction." As she finished speaking, the sun was beginning to set. On cue, thousands of lanterns began to glow throughout the crowd, creating a sea of light that took her breath away. Cassian watched from nearby, his heart swelling with pride and something deeper. Hope, perhaps, or healing. The frightened woman from the courtroom had transformed into a voice for millions, yet had somehow remained completely herself, gentle, sincere, unshakably kind. The crowd stayed peaceful as darkness fell, singing songs of unity and justice. As people began to disperse, many stopped to leave their lanterns at the base of the platform, creating a glowing garden of light. It was nearly midnight when the convoy finally returned to the veterans' community. Mara was exhausted, barely able to keep her eyes open. Cassian helped her from the vehicle, supporting her as they walked inside. "You did it," he said softly. "We did it." She corrected him, managing a tired smile. "All of us together." The veterans gathered in the kitchen, sharing quiet congratulations over cups of tea. They had made history today, and they all knew it. But more importantly, they had done it the right way, with dignity, with peace, with hope. Mara sank into a chair, her silver pendant catching the light. She was too tired to speak, but her heart was full. Outside, a few of the lanterns from the march still glowed in the darkness, like stars brought down to earth, promising that even the longest night would eventually yield to dawn. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows of the veteran community house, casting warm patches across the worn linoleum floor. Mara stirred in her bed, drawn awake by the rich aroma of fresh coffee and the sound of friendly voices downstairs. For the first time in weeks, her heart felt unexpectedly light. She padded down to the kitchen in her borrowed slippers, finding Colonel Briggs and several other veterans gathered around the breakfast table. They were sharing stories and laughing, the morning paper spread between coffee mugs and plates of toast. "There's our voice of hope," Colonel Briggs said warmly, pulling out a chair for her. "Sleep well?" Mara nodded, accepting a steaming mug of coffee from one of the veterans' wives. "Better than I have in a long time," she admitted. The peaceful march had left her feeling accomplished, like maybe things really could change. Through the window, she could see Cassian in the garden, helping some of the veterans repair a fence. He looked different today, clear-eyed, focused, with a sense of purpose that seemed to straighten his shoulders. Sobriety suited him. The morning passed peacefully. Mara helped prepare lunch for everyone, falling into the familiar rhythm of cooking that always brought her comfort. The kitchen filled with the smell of fresh bread and vegetable soup as she worked alongside the community members who had become like family. It was just after 2 o'clock in the afternoon when everything changed. The first indication was the sudden silence of the birds outside. Then came the sound of breaking news alerts, pinging simultaneously from every device in the house. The veterans' faces grew grave as they gathered around the main screen in the living room. The regime's official news channel filled the display. Breaking news: evidence reveals terrorist plot behind recent unrest, the anchor announced with manufactured concern. Previously unreleased security footage shows known agitator Cassian Rowe organizing violent attacks against government facilities. The footage that played was clearly doctored. Grainy clips of Cassian speaking at the Peace March, edited and spliced to make his words sound like calls for violence. They had even digitally altered scenes to show him handling weapons, when Mara knew he had never touched anything more dangerous than a microphone. "This is impossible," she whispered, but the broadcast continued relentlessly. Sources confirm Rowe has been radicalizing vulnerable communities, including elderly veterans, to participate in acts of domestic terrorism, the anchor declared. Law enforcement units have been mobilized to contain the threat. Colonel Briggs was already moving. "They're coming," he said grimly. "Everyone to your stations. This is not a drill." The veterans sprang into action with military precision, some heading to defensive positions, while others began destroying documents and electronic devices. Cassian burst through the door, his face pale. "We need to get Mara out now," he said urgently. "They're already in the neighborhood." But it was too late. The sound of armored vehicles rumbling down the street filled the air, followed by the whir of surveillance drones overhead. Through the windows, they could see tactical units moving into position, their black armor a stark contrast against the peaceful community gardens. "Back door," Colonel Briggs ordered. "Move." The veterans formed a protective circle around Mara as they tried to make their way to the rear of the house. But they had barely reached the kitchen when the first flashbang grenades crashed through the windows. The room filled with disorienting light and sound. Armored troops poured in from every entrance. The veterans fought back with everything they had, years of military training evident in their coordinated defense, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. One by one, they were forced to the ground. "No!" Mara screamed as 2 soldiers grabbed her arms. She struggled against their grip, but their armored gloves were like steel vices. "Let me go!" Cassian lunged forward to help her, but 4 soldiers tackled him to the floor. "Mara!" he shouted, fighting desperately against their hold. "Mara!" They dragged her toward the waiting transport vehicle, her heels scraping against the ground. Colonel Briggs tried one last time to intervene, but a soldier slammed the butt of his rifle into the old veteran's stomach, dropping him to his knees. Mara's screams echoed through the neighborhood as they forced her into the armored transport. The last thing she saw before the doors slammed shut was Cassian's face, anguished, desperate, and filled with a horrible recognition. He had been through this before, watching someone he tried to protect being taken away. History was repeating itself in the cruelest way possible. The soldiers released Cassian once Mara was secured. He scrambled to his feet and ran after the transport, but it was already accelerating away. Its armored bulk grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared around a corner, taking Mara with it. Cassian's legs gave out. He fell to his knees in the middle of the street, surrounded by the aftermath of violence. Broken windows, scattered furniture, wounded veterans being roughly detained. The morning's peace felt like a distant dream now, shattered by the regime's brutal response. The gentle breeze carried the scent of the garden Mara had helped tend, mixed with the acrid smell of smoke from the flashbangs. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. But Cassian remained frozen, staring at the empty street where Mara's transport had vanished, his shoulders shaking with silent grief and rage. The aftermath of violence hung heavy in the autumn air. Emergency vehicles' red and blue lights painted ghostly patterns across the devastated courtyard of the veteran community. Medics moved efficiently between the injured, their white uniforms stark against the gathering darkness. The peaceful garden Mara had tended just that morning lay trampled, flowering plants crushed beneath boot prints and debris. Cassian hadn't moved from his spot on the concrete for hours. His knees ached from the hard surface, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the crushing weight of guilt pressing down on his chest. He stared unseeing at his hands, which still trembled from the morning's violence. "I did this," he whispered to no one in particular. "I brought this down on her, on all of them." Around him, the community that had become their sanctuary lay in ruins. Broken windows gaped like wounds in the building's facades. Overturned furniture littered the courtyard. The carefully tended vegetable gardens were scattered, precious soil spilling across the pavement. But worst of all was the absence of Mara's gentle presence, her soft voice, her kind eyes, her unwavering spirit. Medical personnel moved among the veterans, treating cuts, bruises, and more serious injuries. Some of the older residents had been roughed up badly by the tactical teams. Each pained groan, each request for assistance, drove the knife of responsibility deeper into Cassian's heart. "I should have known better," he muttered, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "I've seen what they're capable of. I should have protected her better." The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed obscene in their beauty given the day's events. Emergency crews started packing up their equipment, leaving behind only a few personnel to monitor the more seriously injured veterans who couldn't be moved. Cassian barely registered the heavy footsteps approaching until Colonel Briggs lowered himself onto the concrete beside him with a grunt of pain. The old soldier's face was bruised, a nasty purple welt spreading across his left cheekbone where a rifle butt had struck him. His usually pristine clothing was torn and dirty, but his eyes retained their steady strength. For a long while, neither man spoke. They sat together in the growing darkness, watching the last rays of sunlight fade from the sky. Finally, Briggs broke the silence. "You planning to sit here all night, son?" His voice was rough but gentle. Cassian didn't look at him. "I failed her, Colonel, just like I failed everyone else who ever counted on me. History repeating itself. Isn't that what they say?" Briggs shifted, wincing at the movement. "You know what I see when I look at you right now? A drunk who should have stayed in his mansion instead of dragging an innocent woman into his mess." "No," Briggs said firmly. "I see a man who's trembling, and there's no shame in that." This finally made Cassian turn to look at him. The colonel's face was serious in the dim light. "Courage isn't about not being afraid, son. It's not about being steady as a rock or never showing weakness. Real courage, the kind that matters, is in the rising. It's in the getting back up when everything in you wants to stay down." "She trusted me," Cassian whispered, his voice cracking. "They all trusted me." "Yes, they did. They still do. The question is, what are you going to do with that trust?" Briggs groaned as he pushed himself to his feet, extending a hand down to Cassian. "You can sit here and let your guilt win, or you can stand up and fight back. The right way, the peaceful way, the way Mara would want us to fight." Cassian stared at the offered hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached up and grasped it. As he stood, he wiped roughly at his eyes with his sleeve. "She's still out there," Briggs continued. "She needs us. needs you to be strong now, not fearless, just strong enough to keep going. Looking around the courtyard, Cassian saw that despite the day's violence, people were already beginning to rebuild. Veterans helped each other clean up debris. Neighbors brought food and supplies. The community was wounded, but unbroken. "What's your call, son?" Briggs asked quietly. Cassian took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "We need to get everyone together. Anyone who can still stand. We're not going to let them win through violence. That's what they want, an excuse to crack down harder." He began walking toward the community center, his steps growing more purposeful with each stride. "We'll show them what real strength looks like. Not with weapons or force, but with unity and determination." Veterans and supporters began gathering around as Cassian spoke, drawn by the renewed purpose in his voice. Even those nursing injuries stood straighter, inspired by his transformation from despair to resolve. "They think they can break us by taking Mara," Cassian continued, his voice growing stronger. "But they don't understand what she taught us all. That dignity and justice are worth standing up for, no matter the cost." Colonel Briggs watched with approval as Cassian organized the group, assigning tasks and responsibilities. They would need medical supplies, communication equipment, transportation. Most importantly, they would need to spread their message of peaceful resistance. The night air had grown cool, but nobody seemed to notice. The community buzzed with renewed purpose as plans took shape. They would face the regime not with violence, but with unwavering determination. They would show the world that even in the darkest moments, hope could not be extinguished. As Cassian worked, his hands had stopped trembling. The guilt wasn't gone. It might never fully leave him, but it no longer paralyzed him. Instead, it fueled his resolve to make things right, to prove himself worthy of the trust placed in him. He caught Colonel Briggs' eye across the room and saw the old soldier nod in approval. Yes, Cassian was afraid. Yes, he was uncertain. But he was standing. He was fighting. And this time, he wouldn't stop until Mara was free and justice was served. The sun crept over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Cassian stood in the parking lot of the Veteran Community Center, watching as vehicle after vehicle arrived. Cars, vans, and buses filled with people who believed in justice. Their faces were determined, yet peaceful. Colonel Briggs approached, leaning on his cane. "Quite a turnout." "More than I expected," Cassian admitted, his voice thick with emotion. He watched as elderly nurses from retirement homes helped each other out of shuttle vans. Young families carried signs and water bottles. Veterans in wheelchairs were assisted by their neighbors. "Everyone knows where to go?" Briggs asked. Cassian nodded, checking his tablet. "The detention center's location was leaked by sympathetic guards last night. We've mapped out the safest routes." He paused, scanning the growing crowd. No weapons, no angry signs, just people standing together. As the sun climbed higher, the caravan began to move. Cassian rode in the lead vehicle, a converted medical transport van. Through his earpiece, he coordinated with volunteer traffic managers who helped guide the peaceful procession through city streets. "Remember," he broadcast to all vehicles, "we move slowly. We stay calm. We show them what real strength looks like." The detention center came into view, a stark concrete building surrounded by high walls. Security cameras swiveled to track the approaching vehicles. Cassian stepped out first, raising his hands to show he carried nothing threatening. "Testing, testing." He spoke into a wireless microphone, his voice echoing across the morning air. "My name is Cassian Rowe. I'm here to broadcast a message to everyone watching, including those inside this facility." The crowd began emerging from their vehicles, hundreds, then thousands of people. They moved with purpose but without aggression, forming neat lines along the street. "We come in peace," Cassian continued, his voice steady. "We are your neighbors, your family members, your fellow citizens. We ask only for transparency and justice. Show the nation that Mara Ellison is being treated humanely. Let independent observers verify her conditions. Inside her cold cell, Mara lay on a thin mattress, trying to stay warm. The first thing she noticed was a change in the guards' voices. Urgent whispers, hurried footsteps. Then, faintly through the thick walls, she heard it. Voices chanting her name. "Mara! Mara! Mara!" She sat up, pressing her ear against the wall. The sound grew stronger, a peaceful chorus of hundreds of voices raised in unity. In the security control room, Captain James Chen watched the monitors with growing concern. "How many are out there now?" "At least 3,000. His lieutenant reported. "More arriving every minute, sir. They're just standing there, singing and praying." Chen wiped sweat from his forehead. The crowd filled every camera view. Elderly people in wheelchairs, mothers with children, veterans standing at attention. Not one weapon in sight. Not one angry gesture. "Sir," another guard called out, "media feeds are picking this up. It's streaming nationwide." On the main screen, Cassian's voice rang clear. "We will not leave until we know Mara is safe. We will not resort to violence. We will simply stand here as witnesses, asking our nation's conscience, is this who we want to be?" The morning stretched into midday. The summer sun beat down, but the crowd remained disciplined. People shared water bottles and umbrellas. Nurses set up first aid stations. Veterans organized bathroom breaks and rest rotations. Cassian's voice continued broadcasting, calm and unwavering. "To those holding Mara, you have families too. You have consciences. You know this isn't right. We're not here to fight you. We're here to help you choose justice over fear." Inside the control room, Captain Chen's phone buzzed again. Another request for instructions from his superiors. Another warning about the growing media coverage. He stared at the monitors, watching as the crowd continued to swell peacefully. "Sir," his lieutenant said softly, "what are your orders?" Chen took a deep breath. In 20 years of security work, he'd never faced anything like this. Violence he understood, riots he could handle, but this quiet strength, this peaceful determination, it shook him to his core. "Get me a direct line to Director Hawthorne," he said finally. This is above my pay grade now." As his lieutenant hurried to comply, Chen watched the main screen. The crowd had begun singing, a gentle, haunting melody that carried through the summer air. In her cell, Mara closed her eyes and listened, tears rolling down her cheeks as hope bloomed in her heart. Outside, Cassian stood straight and tall, surrounded by thousands who refused to look away from injustice. The sun climbed toward its peak, but no one moved. They would stand as long as it took, their presence a testament to the power of peaceful resistance and the strength of human dignity. The whump, whump, whump of helicopter blades cut through the afternoon air, drawing all eyes skyward. A sleek black aircraft descended onto the detention center's landing pad, kicking up dust and causing the crowd to shield their faces. Director Hawthorne emerged, his tailored suit pristine despite the wind, his expression cold and calculating as he surveyed the masses below. "This unauthorized gathering needs to disperse immediately." His amplified voice boomed across the compound. "You are interfering with a legitimate security operation." Cassian stepped forward from the front lines, his movements deliberate and steady. Colonel Briggs moved to stand beside him, his military bearing evident despite his age. Around them, thousands of phones lifted into the air, their cameras, recording every moment. "Director Hawthorne," Cassian's voice carried clearly through his microphone, "we both know there's nothing legitimate about what's happening here. Release all evidence related to Mara Ellison's arrest. Let the public see the truth." The director's face tightened. "Mr. Rowe, you're in no position to make demands. Your own involvement in domestic terrorism—" "Those charges are fabricated and you know it." Cassian interrupted, his voice steady. Just like the charges against Mara. Release the evidence. Show us the real security footage from the transit station. Show us the financial records you claim prove her guilt. Colonel Briggs stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of service. Sir, I served this country for 45 years. These people aren't here to cause trouble. They're here because they believe in justice. Real justice. The crowd murmured in agreement, their phones still streaming every word to millions watching across the nation. Director Hawthorne's jaw clenched as he checked his tablet, no doubt seeing the viewer numbers climbing. Inside the control room, a young technician named Sarah Martinez watched the confrontation on multiple screens. Her hands trembled as she accessed the secured files she'd discovered last night. Footage showing Deputy Director Cade cornering Mara, threatening her, fabricating evidence. With a deep breath, she pressed send on an anonymous upload. The effect was immediate. Phones throughout the crowd began buzzing with notifications. Gasps and angry murmurs spread as people watched the leaked footage. Cassian's own phone lit up, and he held it high. "Director!" he called out, his voice thick with emotion. "The truth is already out. Security footage shows Deputy Director Cade threatening Mara. Internal messages revealed the judge was instructed to find her guilty regardless of evidence. You can't bury this anymore." Hawthorne's face had gone pale as his own tablet filled with incoming reports. His carefully constructed narrative was unraveling in real time, broadcast to the entire nation. "These are unauthorized leaks," he attempted, but his voice had lost its authority. "This footage could be manipulated." "It's not," came a new voice. A security officer stepped out of the building, removing his helmet. "I was there that day. I saw what Deputy Director Cade did. I'm not staying silent anymore." More voices joined in. Other officers, administrative staff, even a court clerk. Each had a piece of the truth to share, and they'd found their courage in the peaceful strength of the crowd. Director Hawthorne's phone buzzed incessantly. Calls from council members, media outlets, other officials all demanding responses. He looked out over the sea of faces, all those phones recording his every move, and realized the game was over. "Open the gates," he said finally, his voice heavy with defeat. The crowd held its breath as the heavy metal doors slowly swung open. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, a small figure appeared in the doorway. Mara stepped into the sunlight, squinting against the brightness. Her uniform was wrinkled, dark circles shadowed her eyes, and bruises marked her wrists where the cuffs had been too tight. But she was alive. A cheer erupted from thousands of throats, a sound of pure joy and relief that echoed off the concrete walls. Mara took one shaky step forward, then another. Cassian broke ranks and ran to her, Colonel Briggs close behind. She managed 3 more steps before her legs gave out. Cassian caught her as she collapsed, gathering her gently in his arms. Tears streamed down both their faces as he held her close, shielding her from the cameras even as drones circled overhead, broadcasting the moment across the country. "You came back for me," she whispered against his shoulder. "We all did," he murmured, gesturing to the crowd. "Every single one of us." Colonel Briggs draped his jacket over her shoulders as the nurses rushed forward with a wheelchair. All around them, people were hugging, crying, celebrating. Some had dropped to their knees in prayer. Others were already organizing blankets, water, and medical supplies for Mara. Through his earpiece, Cassian could hear news anchors struggling to describe the scene. The footage of Mara's mistreatment was trending nationwide. Deputy Director Cade's office was already releasing a statement denying involvement. The corrupt judge had reportedly cleared out his chambers and left the city. But none of that mattered in this moment. What mattered was the woman in his arms, trembling but alive. What mattered was the thousands of ordinary citizens who had stood up peacefully for justice. What mattered was that truth, once exposed to light, could not be hidden again. Director Hawthorne's helicopter lifted off, retreating from the scene he could no longer control. The downdraft ruffled Mara's hair as Cassian helped her into the wheelchair. She reached up and squeezed his hand, her eyes full of gratitude and exhaustion. The crowd parted to create a path for them, hands reaching out to touch Mara's shoulders, to offer quiet words of support. Colonel Briggs walked beside them, his presence keeping the media at a respectful distance even as their drones captured every moment of this triumph of peaceful resistance over corruption. The medical tent had been hastily erected in a nearby park, away from the press of the crowd. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and fresh cotton. Medics moved efficiently between cots, but they all paused when Cassian wheeled Mara through the entrance. A veteran nurse with kind eyes immediately stepped forward. "Let's get you looked at, dear," she said softly, helping Mara onto an examination bed. "I'm Sandra. We'll take good care of you." Cassian started to step back, but Mara's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. "Stay?" she asked, her voice small. He nodded, pulling up a chair beside her. Sandra worked gently but thoroughly, documenting each bruise and abrasion with both medical precision and barely contained anger. The marks on Mara's wrists were particularly concerning, deep purple bands where the restraints had cut in. They kept them too tight on purpose. Mara explained quietly. Said it was protocol. Cassian's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "We'll make sure that protocol changes." While Sandra applied healing ointment and wrapped Mara's wrists, a government courier arrived with urgent summons. The council was convening an emergency session that evening to address the crisis. Both Mara and Cassian's testimony would be required. "She needs rest," Cassian protested, but Mara shook her head. "No," she said firmly, "while the truth is fresh, while they can't hide from it." The council chambers were packed when they arrived 3 hours later. Every seat in the public gallery was filled, with citizens standing along the walls. The councillors themselves looked uncomfortable under the intense scrutiny of multiple camera feeds. Mara spoke first. Her voice started shakily but grew stronger as she recounted everything. Cade's harassment, the fabricated charges, the sham trial, the brutal detention. The chamber fell so silent you could hear the air conditioning hum. "I was targeted because I said no to a powerful man," she concluded. "But I wasn't his first victim, just the first one who couldn't be silenced, thanks to all the people who stood up for justice." When Cassian took the stand, he brought data, financial records showing pattern of abuse, security footage, internal memos. His tech skills had been put to good use during those desperate hours planning Mara's rescue. "This isn't about one corrupt official or one rigged trial," he testified. "This is about a system designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. It needs to change." The session stretched late into the night. Outside, the streets had filled with citizens holding candlelight vigils. News feeds showed similar gatherings in cities across the country. Just before midnight, the first domino fell. The corrupt judge announced his immediate resignation via video link, his face ashen as he read a prepared statement. The council chamber erupted in cheers. Minutes later, breaking news flashed across the screens. Deputy Justice Director Lionel Cade had been taken into custody. The charges included abuse of power, evidence tampering, and multiple counts of harassment. "The system worked," one councillor remarked during a recess. "No," Cassian corrected tiredly. "The people worked. The system just finally got out of their way." It was nearly 2 a.m. when they finally reached the safe house, a modest hotel suite arranged by Colonel Briggs' veterans. Security teams swept the floor hourly, while supporters maintained a protective vigil in the lobby. Mara sat on the edge of the bed, almost swaying with exhaustion. The medics had given her pain medication for her injuries, and it was starting to take effect. "You should sleep," Cassian said from his chair by the window. His own voice was rough with fatigue. "So should you," she replied, but he shook his head. "I'll keep watch. Just rest." Mara wanted to argue, but her eyes were already closing. She lay down, pulling the blanket up to her chin. The last thing she saw was Cassian settling deeper into his chair, his expression softening as he watched over her. She dozed fitfully for a while, memories of the detention center mixing with fragments of the council hearing. When she woke again, the room was quiet, except for soft, steady breathing. Cassian had fallen asleep in the chair, his head tipped to one side. In sleep, the worry lines eased from his face, making him look younger, more like the idealistic reformer he'd once been, before the world had hurt him. Moving carefully, Mara took the spare blanket from the foot of her bed. She shook it out gently and draped it over him, tucking it around his shoulders. He stirred slightly but didn't wake. "Thank you," she whispered, meaning so much more than just the rescue. "Thank you for believing in me, for not giving up, for showing me that one person's courage could spark a movement." Moonlight filtered through the window, casting peaceful shadows across the room. In a few hours, the sun would rise on a changed world. There would be more battles ahead, more reforms needed, more work to be done. But for now, in this quiet moment, Mara let herself feel safe. Let herself be grateful for this man who had risked everything to save her, and for all the ordinary heroes who had stood with him. She returned to her bed, pulled up her own blanket, and finally fell into a deep, healing sleep. The next 48 hours brought changes that no one could have predicted. Like a house of cards caught in a strong wind, the regime's carefully constructed facade crumbled piece by piece. It started with a flood of leaked documents, thousands of internal memos, surveillance recordings, and financial records pouring onto public networks. Tech experts later said the leak came from dozens of sources within the government itself, as if a dam of conscience had finally broken. Mara watched the news feeds in amazement from the safe house. "I can't believe this is really happening," she whispered, her hand covering her mouth, as another high-ranking official announced their resignation. Cassian sat beside her, his eyes clear and focused. 3 days sober had brought back his sharp, strategic mind. "They're jumping ship before they get pushed," he explained. Once the first few went down, the rest knew they couldn't hide anymore. By noon, the Justice Department's entire senior leadership had stepped down. The ruling council dissolved itself by emergency vote, transferring power to an interim civilian oversight board. Citizens flooded the streets in peaceful celebration, singing and embracing strangers. The people need a voice they trust to help guide what comes next, Colonel Briggs told them over a secure video call. "Both of you." The Transitional Justice Council convened the next morning in the old Civic Hall, a diverse group of reform advocates, legal experts, and community leaders. When they formally invited Mara and Cassian to join as special advisors, the chamber erupted in applause. Mara gripped the edge of the podium, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm just a cook who tried to keep her dignity," she said. "But I've learned that dignity isn't just personal. It's something we have to protect for everyone. I'll do my best to help build a system that remembers that." Cassian's speech was shorter but equally heartfelt. "Years ago I tried to fight corruption and failed. I let that failure define me. But thanks to Mara's courage, I got a second chance to stand up for what's right. We all did." That afternoon they drove to the veteran community. The damage from the raid was still visible: broken windows, scuffed walls, trampled gardens. But the spirit of the place remained unbroken. Colonel Briggs met them at the gate, his arm in a sling but his smile wide. "Welcome home, heroes." Mara went to each resident in turn, embracing them with tears in her eyes. "I can never thank you enough." She told them, "You risked everything for a stranger." "Not a stranger," Mrs. Chen corrected, patting Mara's cheek. "Family. You became family the moment you started helping in the kitchen that first day." Cassian rolled up his sleeves and joined a group of veterans repairing window frames. His hands were steady as he measured and cut, focused entirely on the work. Several residents commented on the change in him, not just his sobriety, but a new sense of peace in his bearing. The guilt was eating him alive before. Colonel Briggs confided to Mara as they watched Cassian work. "Sometimes a person needs to fail before they can truly succeed. He needed you as much as you needed him." As the sun began to set, delicious smells wafted from the courtyard. The veterans had set up their old barbecue grills, and soon the air was filled with the sound of sizzling food and laughter. Tables were brought outside, draped with checkered cloths and decorated with candles in mason jars. Someone found an old guitar, and soft music mingled with the conversation and crickets. Mara helped serve plates piled high with grilled vegetables and meat, just as she had during her first days here. But now each interaction was wrapped in deeper meaning, shared smiles acknowledging all they'd been through together. Cassian moved among the tables, refilling water glasses and iced tea. Several times Mara caught him declining, offered drinks with a quiet, "Just water for me, thanks." Each time she saw the pride in the veteran's eyes. As twilight deepened to purple, Colonel Briggs stood and tapped his glass for attention. "A toast," he called out, "to survival, to hope, and to the dawn of a better nation." To survival, hope, and dawn. Everyone echoed, raising their glasses to the stars just beginning to peek through the evening sky. The celebration continued long into the night. Veterans shared stories of past struggles and victories. Young activists who had supported the protests mixed with elderly residents, exchanging perspectives and finding common ground. Children of some community members played tag between the tables, their laughter a reminder of why they had fought so hard for change. Mara sat at a corner table, taking it all in. The warm glow of the candles illuminated faces that had become so dear to her in such a short time. These people had become more than supporters or protectors. They were indeed family. Cassian joined her, offering a plate of grilled corn. In the soft light, she could see the contentment in his expression, so different from the haunted look he'd worn when they first met. "I'll be back often," Mara promised, looking around at the community that had sheltered her. "We both will. This place, these people, they're part of who we are now." Around them, the celebration continued. A moment of joy carved out of difficult times, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The veterans had created more than just a safe haven here. They'd built a foundation for hope, a place where broken things could be mended, where second chances were possible, where the future could be reimagined. The stars twinkled overhead, bearing witness to this gathering of ordinary heroes who had changed their world not through violence or force, but through courage, compassion, and unwavering faith in each other. In the gentle evening breeze, the candle flames danced like beacons, lighting the way forward into a new dawn. A week had passed since the revolution, and life was finding its way back to normal, or rather, a better version of normal. Mara stood outside the familiar doors of Sunset Grove Nursing Home, her heart beating fast with anticipation. She straightened her fresh white apron and took a deep breath. The moment she stepped inside, a chorus of joyful voices rang out. "Mara, she's back!" Elderly residents who could walk had gathered in the lobby, while others watched from wheelchairs. Many held handmade welcome signs with wobbly letters. Tears streamed down wrinkled cheeks as they surrounded her. Mrs. Peterson, 92 years old and usually reserved, broke into loud sobs as she hugged Mara. We watched everything on the news. We were so worried, dear. So worried. I missed you all so much. Mara's voice cracked as she embraced each resident in turn. The meals weren't the same without my favorite taste testers. Mr. Jenkins, a retired schoolteacher, wheeled forward. You showed them what real courage looks like, young lady. We're proud of you. As Mara made her way through the crowd, she noticed improvements to the facility. New security cameras, updated emergency systems, and fresh paint. A sign by the entrance detailed new worker protection policies. Around mid-morning, Cassian arrived carrying a box of pastries from the local bakery. He looked different now, clean-shaven, clear-eyed, wearing a simple button-down shirt rather than his former rumpled suits. The residents welcomed him warmly, several patting his arm and thanking him for protecting their Mara. I'm working with the Transitional Council to implement better safety measures for care workers nationwide, he explained as he helped Mara prepare lunch in the kitchen. Security systems, fair wages, harassment prevention, everything we learned from your case. Mara smiled as she chopped vegetables. It means so much that something good came from all this, that other people will be safer. After lunch service, they walked together through the nursing home's garden. Summer flowers bloomed in neat beds, and butterflies danced between the plants. Their footsteps crunched softly on the gravel path. How are you really doing? Cassian asked quietly. After everything? Mara considered the question carefully. I'm healing. Some nights are still hard, but being back here helps. Having purpose, routine, people who need me. She paused. How about you? How's sobriety? One day at a time. He replied with gentle honesty. Colonel Briggs calls every morning to check on me. The veterans have become my support system. They walked in comfortable silence, their shoulders occasionally brushing. There was no rush to define what was growing between them, just a quiet understanding, a deepening trust. As twilight approached, the residents began gathering by the garden pond. It was a tradition Mara remembered well from before her arrest, the monthly lantern ceremony. But tonight felt different, more significant. Cassian helped steady elderly hands as they placed paper lanterns on the dark water. Each light represented a prayer, a hope, a dream of justice. The tiny flames reflected in the pond like stars fallen to earth. Mrs. Peterson spoke softly as she set her lantern afloat. For a country where no one fears speaking truth. For the young ones who'll inherit a better world. Mr. Jenkins added, releasing his own light. One by one, the lanterns drifted across the water, forming a constellation of hope. Mara and Cassian stood side by side, watching the gentle procession of lights. His hand found hers in the growing darkness, and she squeezed it softly. The evening air was sweet with jasmine, and crickets had begun their twilight chorus. Around the pond, residents sat on benches or in wheelchairs, sharing stories and memories, their faces illuminated by the floating lanterns. In that moment, surrounded by these gentle souls who had become family, Mara felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. The nation was changing, healing, growing toward something better. And here, in this garden with these people, she was exactly where she needed to be. The lanterns continued their slow dance across the water, each light a promise of brighter days ahead as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky above. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.